In 1934, a tenant farmer's wife in Oklahoma fed 7 children 3 meals a day on 12 cents. She did it for 9 years straight. Every cheap meal on this list came from a kitchen like hers. Number 47 on this list cost less than 2 cents a serving and was on the menu in 3 out of 4 Depression-era homes. Number 22 stretched a single pound of beans across 4 days. Number 1 on this list is a meal so cheap the WPA published the recipe on government pamphlets. These 60 meals were not cookbook food. They were what women cooked in empty pantries against 10 empty plates and a paycheck that already ran out. Hit subscribe before this list ends. Here are the 60 cheap meals our grandparents ate to survive the Great Depression. Water pie sounds like it shouldn't work. The people who made it in the 1930s mostly agreed, but they made it anyway because the alternative was no pie at all. An unbaked shell, 1½ cups of cold water, a 1/4 cup of flour, a cup of sugar, a few pats of butter, a little vanilla. That was it. The oven did the rest, almost an hour at heat, and then the pie had to chill completely before it would hold a slice. Versions appeared in American newspapers as early as the 1870s, when winter meant hens and cows slowed and eggs and milk grew scarce. The Depression simply returned it to tables that had moved on. What it tasted like was a mild, sweet, buttery custard, not rich, not complicated, but honest in the way only very simple food can be. She made it when there was nothing else, and she made it well. That matters more than most people realize. Long before pancakes became a diner staple, Depression-era families turned to Johnny Cakes, a humble cornmeal-based flatbread, as a trusted source of inexpensive nourishment. Originally introduced by early American settlers, Johnny Cakes saw a resurgence during the Depression, becoming popular again due to their affordability and accessibility. Made from little more than cornmeal, salt, and water or milk, this simple batter transformed into golden, crispy patties that creatively replaced costly ingredients like wheat flour or eggs. Resourceful home cooks often pan-fried Johnny Cakes in leftover bacon grease or saved drippings from other meals, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Families got creative, too. Some would sweeten these cakes slightly with molasses or honey, while others spiced them up with savory leftovers, stretching a modest meal into something memorable. Food historians share an amusing anecdote. Because cornmeal was abundant and dirt cheap, some folks humorously called Johnny Cakes the poor man's pancake, a nickname many wore proudly, turning frugality into a source of culinary pride. Dandelion coffee was one of the many substitutes that appeared when coffee beans were either unavailable or unaffordable. Families would dig up dandelion roots, roast them carefully until dark, and grind them into a coarse powder. When brewed, the result resembled coffee in both color and aroma, though the flavor carried a bitter earthiness all its own. For those accustomed to real coffee, it was not quite the same, but it became a daily ritual that provided both warmth and comfort in lean times. Children and adults alike drank it, often with a little sugar or milk if available to soften the bitterness. Because dandelions were free and abundant, the drink spread widely in both rural and urban areas. It symbolized the Depression's spirit of using whatever nature offered, even weeds, to replace expensive imports. For many families, dandelion coffee was not just a beverage, but a reminder that comfort could still be found in the simplest, most overlooked places. Vinegar as a tenderizer was one of those tricks that quietly revolutionized Depression-era cooking. Tough cuts of meat were often all you could afford, gristly, chewy, and almost impossible to enjoy unless you knew how to treat them right. That is where vinegar came in. Just a quick soak in a vinegar-based marinade would soften the meat, break down the fibers, and help it absorb flavor. You did not need anything fancy. A splash of vinegar, a little salt, and maybe some dried herbs if you had them. Let it sit for a few hours or overnight, and suddenly that cheap cut of meat became something worth savoring. It was not about masking the toughness, it was about transforming it. Vinegar brought out the best in whatever you had, and it worked just as well on vegetables too. You would see it used in greens, stews, and even in boiled dishes to brighten up bland or starchy flavors. It became a staple because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and incredibly versatile. And the best part? It gave home cooks a sense of control when everything else felt uncertain. Ham bone soup stretched a single Christmas ham into weeks of nourishment for families who could barely afford meat. When a family managed to purchase or barter for a ham during the holidays, nothing was discarded. The bone became foundation for soup that could feed everyone multiple times. The bone simmered for hours in large iron pots, releasing rich marrow and smoky flavor into broth, while dried beans softened alongside it. Root vegetables from the cellar, carrots, turnips, potatoes, joined the pot, creating a meal both hearty and affordable. Every bit of meat clinging to the bone was carefully scraped and returned to the soup. Families ladled steaming bowls of this broth throughout the week following Christmas, each serving a reminder of the holiday meal. Ham bone soup represented practical magic of Depression-era cooking, where one purchase became many meals. It was more than sustenance. It bridged holiday celebration and ordinary survival for families counting every penny. During an era when sweet treats were rare, Depression-era cooks mastered the art of stretching pantry leftovers into indulgences like potato donuts. Ingeniously crafted from leftover mashed potatoes, yes, potatoes, these fluffy confections surprised skeptics by becoming a genuine potluck hit. Housewives creatively substituted pricey ingredients such as eggs or butter with potatoes, which provided moisture and tenderness, making the donuts delightfully soft without overspending. After all, potatoes weren't just filling, they were incredibly economical, versatile, and available year-round. Cooks cleverly spiced the dough with cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla when available, then deep-fried batches in whatever cooking fat was handy, usually lard or bacon grease, giving these treats irresistible crisp edges. Historically, potato-based baked goods were common in European communities long before the Depression, but American households rediscovered them out of necessity, turning leftover dinner sides into sugary morning miracles. So, there's actually just a bit more to sewing than this initial analysis will tell you. Sewing became popular for lots of reasons, but the biggest two were probably the practical use of it and the fact that it let people vent. What do I mean by that? Times like the Depression are pretty much ideal scenarios and environments for growing an extremely frustrated population, and, well, not to make a silver lining where there really isn't one, but people like that make some pretty good art. They need creative outlets. They need places they can express themselves and ways they can unwind. Sewing managed to be that thing for a lot of people, and it helped because it meant that they could spend the time and keep the hunger at bay by distracting themselves with sewing. It helped save costs, make new clothes, and repair old ones. If you had a simple cut or two, instead of wasting time, gas, and money going to the clinic for a stitch, you'd just get someone in your family to sew it up. Sounds extreme? That was reality just 100 years ago. We've got all sorts of fancy pies nowadays, from chocolate hazelnut mousse to blackberry merlot, but Grandma's banana cream pie was the talk of the town in the 60s. Do you remember coming home to a chilly slice of this delicacy? This one was a guaranteed crowd pleaser, and that's why it was the star of the table during the holidays. Here's the thing. Bananas were very readily available in the US in the 1950s till 1960s, which means people had to come up with creative ways of eating them. And well, grandmas know best, especially when it comes to hearty desserts. The post-World War II era saw a boom in convenience foods and desserts that were easy to make at home, and banana cream pie fit perfectly into this trend. This wasn't just your favorite dessert. It was reportedly a favorite of President Harry S. Truman, who had a sweet tooth for simple, homey desserts. There was also a no-bake version of the banana cream pie, perfect for summer days when turning on the oven wasn't ideal. So, in the very same way that people started to use drippings to make gravy, people also started to save the grease from the bacon they were cooking. Although bacon in and of itself was a rarity in most households, it would come every now and then as a part of government relief programs and food drive efforts. Some people would also manage to keep scraps and bits, or sometimes even entire strips. Those times were really lucky, and bacon was a prized resource. It wasn't that there was nothing that could substitute bacon, and hell, you even had some mushrooms that came pretty close to mimicking the texture and sometimes even the taste. It was just that nothing would give you the same comfort. Still, that didn't mean that was an excuse to let everything go to waste in just one use. People made great use of their bacon grease as an affordable and convenient substitute for fat, which was something they were sorely missing otherwise. They'd often even reuse the grease many times and try to get as much out of it as possible. It was good for frying and for making meals a bit more filling, but it did take a toll on the heart. Speaking of things that are readily available and easily grown, I can't forget about apples and how much they helped in the 20th century. You could get them from local orchards, canned, and even in stores. They were still a slightly reasonable place. People made all sorts of dishes with apples, like apple walnut cakes with orange glazes. Now, at first sound, that might feel like a pretty odd mix of flavors, but just humor me for a second. Dried fruit like walnuts was foraged or purchased, since they also managed to escape the worst of the rising inflation. Foraging walnuts was a lot easier in areas where they were grown naturally, like California, so this cake took off with the crowd there. Floridians also used to get by on this cake a lot, so you can trust that you might find some use out of it too, especially if you're from those states. Back to the cake though, because there's a lot to talk about flavor-wise here. This cake used those and an orange glaze to make a really fruity cake overall that had a tangy, citrusy flavor profile, but a satisfying walnut crunch, along with the bitterness and sweetness of a nice, ripe apple. All in all, it's not a bad deal for the circumstances. Plus, in the guise of a cake, you were actually eating some pretty healthy fruits. The best thing about this cake was that it could stand on its own without any frosting or decor, and it could also be baked in one single pan. The glaze balanced the earthiness and bitterness of the walnuts, and the apples were right in the middle of the flavor spectrum, whereas the nuts and oranges were on opposite ends. This meant that you had a pretty well-balanced dish for almost no effort or money, and that was a godsend back then. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Peanut butter cost about 10 cents a pound in the 1930s, making it one of the cheapest proteins a family could buy when meat was mostly out of reach. So it went into everything. And it went into bread. Peanut butter bread needed no yeast and no eggs. Flour, baking powder, brown sugar, peanut butter, and milk worked together into a dense, nutty loaf that baked for the better part of an hour. Still warm from the oven, sliced thick with a smear of homemade jam, it felt like a reward rather than a necessity. Your grandmother might have eaten it plain. She might have had butter on hers if there was any. She ate it because it was there and because she had helped make it, standing at the kitchen counter measuring peanut butter in big spoonfuls. That memory, the weight of the spoon, the smell of the oven, stayed with people long after the bread was gone. Nobody bakes it now. When Depression-era homemakers faced piles of leftover mashed potatoes, tossing them out wasn't even on the menu. Instead, they turned to the wonderfully versatile dish known as mashed potato pancakes. With affordability and accessibility in mind, this clever recipe utilized basic kitchen ingredients: leftover potatoes, flour, egg, and perhaps a sprinkle of onion or herbs if they were lucky. By frying these ingredients into golden brown pancakes, cooks skillfully transformed last night's side dish into today's main attraction, proving their ingenuity in reducing waste and maximizing resources. Beyond economy, potato pancakes became a Depression-era favorite for their satisfying crispness, turning humble leftovers into something you'd genuinely anticipate. Creativity born from necessity drove home cooks to experiment by folding in diced onions, stray ham bits, or even a dash of paprika, crafting variations that rivaled their breakfast cousins at fancy hotels. Amusingly, families soon realized these pancakes were so deliciously economical that purposely making extra mashed potatoes became standard practice. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Oatmeal meat stretching was not about fooling anyone, it was about feeding everyone. When a pound of ground meat had to serve a family of 6, something had to give. The trick was to cook oats just enough so they were soft, then fold them into the meat mixture with salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of onion. The oats bulked up the meat, absorbing juices and holding everything together in meatloaf, patties, or croquettes. The taste did not change much, but the yield nearly doubled. This method made its way into thousands of Depression-era dinners, not as a gimmick, but as a lifesaver. It meant one piece of meat could stretch into 3 meals. For kids, it was just dinner. For parents, it was peace of mind. You could even season the oats first for extra flavor, or mix in an egg if you were lucky enough to have one. Leftovers were sliced cold or reheated in a pan, crisped at the edges and served again. Oatmeal made meat go further, and going further was the only way to survive. That stretch, that little bit extra, kept the table full when money and meat were running low. Fried cornmeal mush transformed breakfast leftovers into something resembling Christmas treat when sliced and crisped in hot fat. The mush from morning was poured into loaf pans and allowed to cool until firm enough to slice into thick rounds or rectangles. These slices were then fried in bacon grease, lard, or whatever cooking fat the family had saved, until the outsides turned golden and crispy while the insides stayed soft and warm. Served with molasses, sorghum syrup, or a sprinkle of precious sugar, the fried mush became something children actually looked forward to eating. The contrast between crunchy exterior and creamy interior made each bite interesting, a rare pleasure during times when most food was merely functional. Mothers appreciated that one batch of cornmeal could provide both breakfast and supper, stretching resources across multiple meals. Fried cornmeal mush proved that even the simplest ingredients could be elevated with technique, bringing small moments of joy to Depression-era holiday tables. When times were lean during the Great Depression, cooks knew throwing out perfectly edible beet greens was nearly as scandalous as wasting money. Resourcefully, they crafted dishes like beet greens and potato stir-fry, a wholesome skillet meal that paired hearty potatoes with vibrant, nutritious beet tops, usually dismissed as garden scraps. Economical, tasty, and vitamin-rich, beet greens provided essential nutrients like iron and potassium, making them a vital dietary addition when produce was limited. Clever cooks sautéed chopped beet tops in a skillet alongside sliced potatoes, often using bacon fat or lard as flavorful substitutes for costly butter or oils. Interestingly, beet greens were traditionally popular among immigrant communities, particularly Eastern European and Italian households, who'd long understood the value of using every vegetable part. American families quickly caught on, learning that what once seemed merely compost-bound could become a hearty supper. Potatoes offered bulk and calories, complementing the delicate bitterness of greens without stretching tight grocery budgets. This dish exemplified Depression-era ingenuity, transforming humble ingredients into a flavorful medley suitable for communal gatherings or family meals. It was a lot easier to use wooden stoves too. The availability of fuel was always something that was up in the air. Even the people that were rich enough to have fancy stoves would switch to coal-based ones or ones that used firewood. It was a lot cheaper, and in rural areas this was pretty much entirely the norm, really. It helped to be self-sufficient and provide a steady source of fuel, and more importantly, of fire. In the winters, it was really hard to spare the expenses for heaters and other ways to warm yourself up. Wooden stoves also doubled as lifesavers for making do with limited resources. Families would gather fallen branches, chop wood, or even burn old furniture for fuel. Coal, when affordable, became a go-to substitute, but many relied on foraging for firewood in nearby forests. These stoves weren't just for cooking. They became the heart of the home during winter, where families huddled around them to stay warm. Cleverly placing pots and pans on the stove maximized the heat's reach, warming up rooms and stretching fuel to last longer. It wasn't like the American people, who were facing a pretty serious patch of unemployment, could pay for insulation or central heating either. These are the same people who couldn't manage to pay for the fuel they needed to cook every day. Why do you think they're using these stoves in the first place? It wasn't always bad, though. They could give the heat an entire house would need, and they would also make the food taste better, too. Well, rice pudding is also one that wasn't just delicious, but also healthy. Don't you love it when sweet treats come with health benefits? Talk about a good deal. So, I'm sure I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of this one because who doesn't remember the taste of rice pudding? It started out as a way to use up leftover rice and soon became the dessert that had everyone coming back for seconds. Not only this, but rice pudding was one of the easiest desserts to make and was made with ingredients easily found around the house like rice, milk, and sugar. Rice pudding originated in Europe and was brought to the States by European immigrants. Our grandmas decide to take the classic dessert up a notch by adding some key ingredients like vanilla, nutmeg, maple syrup, or cinnamon. Now, with the change in tastes and trends, this one never made it to big restaurants, but let's be honest, Grandma made it better than any Michelin star chef could possibly have. It's something about making sweet treats with a whole lot less sugar and a whole lot more love. If you do hear wedding bells because of this dish, know you did a great job. Potato candy is something you will never hear about today. I mean, what even is that? Candies and potatoes are on the opposite end of the spectrum. You've heard of things like candied apples. And sure, that makes enough sense, but what's the deal here? Mashed potatoes that were mixed with powdered sugar is where this baby starts, and it ends up creating a dough that you can roll out pretty easily. The real kick is that this dough can be mixed and filled with peanut butter, and you don't need any special equipment, trick, or kitchen appliance to do that. You just need a good old-fashionable potato and some sugar. Once your dough is filled, you just cut it into these potato shapes and bake it. I know what you're thinking, that it wouldn't taste like candy at all, that it would just be this weird potato mess that didn't hit and rather killed your appetite. Firstly, you gotta lower those standards because people in the Depression were not picky eaters. Secondly, it actually was pretty sweet. The potato was just used as a binding agent, not a main source of flavor. That was really just the powdered sugar and peanut butter that made this candy sweet and fudgy. Mock chicken legs, a true culinary illusion of the Great Depression. When actual chicken legs were too expensive to buy, people had to get creative, crafting drumsticks out of inexpensive cuts of meat like pork or veal and shaping them to look like the real thing. These so-called legs were then breaded, fried, or baked, and served up with high hopes that no one would notice the difference. And honestly, in times as hard as those, nobody even cared which meat they were having, as long as it tasted good and filled you up. The beauty of mock chicken legs is that for a split second, you would forget that it wasn't an actual chicken leg on your plate, rather something that resembled one. It was a brilliant way for families to serve something that felt like a treat without the high cost. Plus, let's give a shout out to all those women who shaped that meat to look like a drumstick. That takes a certain level of dedication. It's a testament to how far people were willing to go to make ends meet while still putting something fun on the table. Mock chicken legs became household favorites, proving that with a little creativity in the kitchen, you could really stretch that budget. Nobody looked at a boiled russet potato and thought candy. Nobody except the women who knew. The potato had to be cold. That part was non-negotiable. Mash it smooth, work in powdered sugar a cup at a time until you had a stiff dough, roll it thin on a sugared board, spread peanut butter across the surface, roll it up tight like a jelly roll, chill it, slice it. What came out looked like a pastry spiral. Pale dough swirled with brown peanut butter, cut clean into pinwheels. It tasted like peanut butter fudge. It tasted nothing like potato. Potato candy traced to Irish and German immigrant families spread through Appalachian kitchens by Pennsylvania Dutch settlers, where peanut butter became the standard filling. In Kansas, they used walnuts. In New England, coconut. The filling changed by county. The potato dough never did. No one who didn't already know would have guessed what it was made of. That was the point. Few Depression-era meals evoke nostalgia quite like the hearty duo known as beans and cornbread. In homes where budgets were stretched thin, pairing protein-packed beans with simple, inexpensive cornbread wasn't just tasty, it was brilliantly practical. Dried beans, easy to store and remarkably affordable, found their match in cornbread, made with cheap cornmeal readily available in nearly every pantry. Here's where creativity born from necessity truly shined. Cooks would simmer beans slowly, sometimes flavoring them cleverly with bacon scraps or garden-grown herbs, turning limited supplies into deeply satisfying comfort food. Interestingly, cornbread had a dual role. Not only did it stretch a meal to feed extra mouths, but leftover cornbread was frequently repurposed, crumbled into soups, stews, or transformed into next-day stuffing. Talk about reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians have noted this humble pairing provided crucial nutrients too, ensuring struggling families stayed nourished despite financial hardships. Beans and cornbread even inspired a beloved jazz classic in the 1940s, capturing American hearts and stomachs in song, a sure sign of its enduring significance. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Salt pork steaming for flavor was one of those tricks passed down without ever hitting paper. When beans were on the menu, which was often, a small piece of salt pork was tied in cloth or hung over the pot while everything simmered. The pork never touched the beans. It just hovered, steaming, sweating, lending its salty, smoky essence to the bubbling pot below. It was a way to stretch flavor without using up meat. The same chunk might be reused for multiple batches, trimmed and hung again until it was dry and lean. Beans took on the taste of meat without costing you the real thing. It was economical, practical, and deeply clever. In a time when every ounce of protein had to count, that little piece of pork did heavy lifting. And the resulting beans, soft, savory, and touched with richness, fed families for pennies. Molasses cookies were the sweet tradition that survived when sugar became too expensive for Christmas baking. Blackstrap molasses cost less than refined sugar and was available at every country store, giving these cookies their dark color and robust flavor. The dough was mixed by hand in wooden bowls, combining flour, lard or bacon drippings, eggs, and generous molasses until it formed a sticky, fragrant mass. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were added when available, transforming simple ingredients into something that tasted like the holidays. Cookies baked on greased pans until edges crisped and centers stayed soft, filling kitchens with spiced aroma children would remember for decades. Mothers made batches large enough to share with neighbors and to leave out for relatives. The dark sweetness hit the tongue differently than sugar, deeper, almost earthy, with mineral notes that tasted like comfort. Molasses cookies proved Christmas could still taste special, even when pennies stretched impossibly far. Families in the Depression had a love-hate relationship with beans. They might have groaned at their constant appearance, but couldn't deny the beans' wallet-friendly virtues. Out of necessity, home cooks creatively reimagined this humble legume, crafting hearty dishes like the bean loaf with tomato sauce, a meatloaf look-alike minus the meat. Instead of pricey ground beef, mashed beans took center stage, mixed cleverly with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings to mimic texture and flavor. Tomato sauce, generously spooned over top, was often homemade from canned tomatoes, stretching ingredients even further and adding essential moisture and richness. Interestingly, dried beans were so affordable and nutrient-rich that Depression-era government agencies promoted them heavily, distributing free recipe books highlighting dishes like bean loaves to help struggling families. Clever substitutions were key. Eggs, used to bind traditional loaves, were replaced by soaked breadcrumbs or oatmeal, a clever trick still useful today. Although bean loaf might not inspire enthusiastic applause at contemporary potlucks in the 1930s, it symbolized ingenuity and resilience, proving beans could become delicious comfort food, even if reluctantly embraced. In the same way people would reuse their leftovers, people would cut trips to the doctor as much as they could. It was simple. A lot of the time, the doctor's advice just was not something you could apply in real life. They would tell you to give consultation fees, then ask you to buy 3 pills and syrups that you aren't even sure will work or not. Honestly, I don't think they're sure either. People would end up using things like chicken soup to cure colds, flu, and other kinds of basic issues. This is another reason why people really wanted to save their meat too. Instead of just wasting it on a day when you really miss the taste of chicken or beef, it was better to save it for when people in the household inevitably fell sick and need something like an actual beef stew. Lemons, when they couldn't be used for cleaning in the house, were used for things like sore throats and in place of cough syrup. The trick was to use lemon and mix it in with warm water and honey. This actually does work, so kudos to them. It's even believed by doctors to help relieve any discomfort in the throat. Lemon was used also because it had a lot of vitamin C in it, and that helped people boost the strength of their immune system. The less sick you got, the better it was for your funds. You can't possibly have a conversation about forgotten grandma desserts and not bring up the infamous blackberry cobbler. This one was a summer favorite when blackberries were in season and at their peak of flavor. So, cobblers have their roots in early American history. Pioneers who traveled across the country had to make do with what they had, and traditional pies were difficult to bake on the road. Instead, they would cover the fruit with a layer of biscuit dough or batter and cook it in a Dutch oven, creating what we now know as a cobbler. The blackberries didn't only give the cobbler some flavor, but also packed it with antioxidants. This dessert was particularly famous in southern states and was a staple at many Southern family gatherings, church picnics, and barbecues. Depression cake has a history to it. It was known as wartime cake, and it was also known as wacky cake. But what it was not known for was being well documented. There are lots of misrepresentations surrounding the history of Depression cake. Some people think it started exclusively during the First World War, and some think that it wasn't actually used too much by people who were baking during the Depression. However, as always, there's a bit of truth to all of these claims and lots of exaggeration too. The things that made Depression cake in particular stand out were the ways it used no eggs, milk, or any kind of butter. This is what made it stand out so much in a time like this. You walk up to people and tell them you can bake them a cake that doesn't take anything they can't afford and, in fact, probably makes use of stuff they already have. What you did need for this cake was shortening or vegetable oil. Next, some baking soda for leavening. Then, you'd take some cocoa powder, water, and lemon juice or vinegar. This would really help bring things together by activating the soda. As you can tell, that's a pretty inexpensive lineup of ingredients. In fact, it's probably the easiest recipe I've ever seen for a cake. Depression cakes were how people got around to celebrating anniversaries and birthdays and all kinds of things that people would usually celebrate with some kind of dessert. Grand-père dans le sirop might make you think you're ordering some real fancy pearl of French cooking at a restaurant, but it's just a humble French-Canadian dish that literally translates to grandfather in syrup. It's a really good dish that just needs some basic ingredients, like sugar, flour, baking powder, water, and milk. If some of these weren't available, then you could make do with the next closest substitute. And I know flour was something not every house could rely on having. The Depression made a lot of basic things get out of reach like that, but this was basically just dumplings cooked in a sweet syrup, and dumplings were something that the populace had more or less given up on seeing for a while, so this dish was a little ray of hope. In rural areas and French-speaking communities, this dish took small amounts of sugar and syrup and made the best use out of it, making a dish that could be passed around the entire family. While on the topic of soup, let's not forget to mention onion soup. And since it is fall and fall is the soup-making season, maybe you'll get an idea or two on what to make for your next dinner. The onion soup was proof that even the humblest ingredients could make a delicious meal. In case you didn't know, when you're working on a tight budget, onions become your best mates. They were widely available and quite cheap at the time, so they were the go-to vegetable in hard times. When you mix a few onions and some broth, even if it's just water and a bouillon cube, you'll get yourself a soup that's rich in flavor but light on your wallet. The thing that makes onion soup such a classic and timeless meal is its simplicity. Though caramelizing onions takes a bit of time and patience, they add a depth of flavor that makes you forget you're eating something as simple as soup. Once they hit that sweet golden spot, there's no coming back. With just a few ingredients, you can create something that feels gourmet, even when times are lean. But we can't forget the bread and cheese. No onion soup is complete without them. Traditionally, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of cheese are broiled on top. But even without this fancy finish, onion soup remains a delicacy of this time. What fascinates me about onion soup is that it manages to make an ingredient such as an onion the star of the show, making it into a bowl of comfort that feels like a splurge, even though it is not. The recipe showed up on radio programs and in women's periodicals all through the 1930s. Oatmeal cookies made without eggs, milk, or butter. Every household that tried them developed a version within a generation. The base never changed. Rolled oats, shortening, brown sugar, water, vanilla, flour, baking soda. Creamed together, dropped in spoonfuls onto a greased pan, 12 minutes at 350. What came out had a soft interior and crisped edge, and that deep toasty oat flavor that no amount of butter would have improved. Some grandmothers added raisins, some added cinnamon. Some kept them plain because plain was what the children wanted, and the children were what mattered. The tin was always in the same spot on the same shelf. You knew better than to get into it before supper. You got into it anyway. She never said a word because there were always enough. And making sure there were always enough was what knowing this recipe meant. During an era when store-bought meals were rare luxuries and wasting food was unthinkable, resourceful cooks relied heavily on their gardens, pantries, and plenty of improvisation. It was precisely under these circumstances that biscuits topped with tomato gravy became a beloved staple in Depression-era households. The dish was ingenious, showcasing creativity born from necessity. Leftover tomatoes, often bruised or overripe, simmered down slowly into a savory, thickened gravy, perfectly illustrating how reducing waste and maximizing resources became a domestic art form. Affordability and accessibility played pivotal roles too, as biscuits required only a handful of pantry ingredients like flour, shortening, and milk. Interestingly, tomato gravy was especially popular in southern regions, not only because tomatoes thrived there, but also because folks humorously declared, "When meat's missing from your gravy, tomatoes step right in." In fact, many Depression-era families fondly recall tomato gravy as their saving grace, turning otherwise plain, dry biscuits into satisfying meals without breaking their limited budgets. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Hardtack reinvention was the ultimate act of culinary redemption. That rock-hard biscuit, meant for long journeys and military rations, was not exactly anyone's idea of a good meal. But when food ran low and stomachs were empty, people found a way to make even hardtack useful. The trick was soaking it in warm milk or broth until it softened just enough to chew. Sometimes it was broken up and added to stews, where it melted into the mixture and thickened it like dumplings would. Other times it was sweetened and turned into a sort of pudding, with cinnamon and a splash of canned milk. It took patience and a strong jaw if you rushed it. But that dense cracker, once nearly inedible, became something you could actually look forward to. The key was in treating it like a building block, not a finished dish. People used what they had, and what they had was usually stale, dry, and overlooked. Still, they coaxed comfort from it. That is what made the trick so powerful. When you can turn something like hardtack into a warm, filling dish, it reminds you that no ingredient and no person is beyond saving. Prune cake brought dense, moist sweetness to Christmas tables when other fruits were too expensive. Dried prunes were affordable, shelf-stable, and available year-round at general stores, making them reliable for families who could not afford fresh fruit or canned goods. The batter was enriched with stewed prunes chopped and folded throughout, along with spices like cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg that transformed simple ingredients into something festive. Baked in cast-iron pans, the cake emerged dark, fragrant, and moist in ways other Depression-era cakes rarely achieved. The prunes kept it from drying out, allowing it to be made ahead for Christmas Day. Some families added powdered sugar dustings while others served slices plain, letting fruit and spices speak for themselves. Prune cake was practical rather than glamorous, but it delivered real satisfaction to families who had learned that survival and celebration could coexist, each slice proving modest ingredients could still create holiday memories. Canned foods were lifesavers during the Depression, transforming pantries into treasure troves of culinary creativity. Enter Depression-era salmon pea wiggle, a whimsically named dish that brought some much-needed amusement and nutrition to potluck gatherings of the 1930s. At first glance, the unusual combination of canned salmon, peas, and white sauce spooned over crunchy crackers might raise eyebrows today. Yet back then, it represented clever homemaking at its best. Fresh fish was often prohibitively expensive, so budget-savvy cooks leaned on canned salmon, easily accessible and surprisingly nutritious, providing protein and omega-3s without emptying the purse. Similarly, fresh produce shortages led resourceful households to canned peas, giving the dish color and sweetness at minimal cost. The creamy white sauce was typically fashioned from pantry staples. Milk stretched thinly with flour or, in leaner times, water mixed with bacon grease as a tasty substitution. The quirky name wiggle likely came from the slightly jiggly texture of the white sauce, a playful touch, injecting a bit of fun into challenging circumstances. So if you might recall, then just a while back I mentioned how people started to move in together because it helped to survive together. Well, that spirit, or that entire mindset, actually spread way past just people's immediate or extended families. People began to share all kinds of things with their neighbors, and it was a big way to live during the entire Depression. You just couldn't cut it alone, and the ones that tried learned pretty soon that it really helped to keep ties with people. You could help share resources. Whatever you had that another house didn't could end up helping them. You had plenty of reason to help them too, because it simply wasn't possible that you wouldn't end up in a tough spot soon too. People wanted good ties with those around them because they could help them out of sticky situations like that. There were even things like communal dinners. Entire neighborhoods would get together and arrange feasts for every home on the block. People could make a lot more food when they were pooling everything they had together to cook one big meal for everyone, as opposed to lots of tiny meals and individual servings throughout the day. Land your man, baked beans suddenly are a tried and tested method. I mean, you don't get a moniker like that for nothing, right? These typically get served as a topping for bratwurst or hot dogs, or served as a side for a main event that lies more on the barbecue side. The beans are made with ground beef, onions, and bell peppers, so they definitely are the perfect side to any kind of savory or tangy experience. One of the best sauces to use was Texas Pete sauce, but any kind of Tabasco works. If you have hardwood smoked bacon, though, that's definitely what cookbooks recommend, along with Taco Bell seasoning. As far as beans, any kind of canned beans work, but if you're looking for a specific recommendation that really encapsulates that mid-1900s flavor profile, then you should go for Bush's original baked beans. Either way, you're in for a great time with these. Try making them for a special someone on a romantic evening, and maybe you might get lucky in other ways too. Dandelion greens. I can't tell you how big of a lifesaver these things were for the masses during the Depression. Dandelions were literally, and I mean this in every sense of the word, everywhere. They were in your city parks, they were in farms, they were on the wild plant growth past the sidewalk, on the hills, just about everything. It was one of the plants that grew in the wild that was also edible, and it cost literally nothing. People eventually started to forage on a national scale for dandelions whenever they could. You didn't need any kind of equipment or skills to make it work, and you also didn't need to do anything special for it to make it into a meal. You could straight up just eat the dandelion leaves, and sometimes people used the flowers and roots too. As far as the roots went, they made good herbal medication for tiny Band-Aid fixes. The flowers, on the other hand, could be fried, and they could also be used to make jelly sometimes. The yellow petals of the flower were boiled in water, and that would actually help make a liquid. Once you combine that with molasses or brown sugar and some pectin, which was hard to get but could be substituted with other binding agents, you'd get a serviceable jelly out of it. Wacky cake was known as depression cake, and it's not half as depressing as it actually sounds. It got that name, though, because it was everyone's idea on how to keep your sweet tooth in check and still get a cake somehow. Back then, the ingredients for cakes were just getting rarer and rarer. People had already given up on keeping stable supplies of flour and butter, but some couldn't even have eggs and milk on a regular basis. That's why this no-fuss cake that didn't take anything to make shine the way it did, and for something called depression cake, it sure put a smile on everyone's face. Moving on to something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired, a main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. Saturday night was taffy night in a lot of Depression-era households, and it was entertainment as much as cooking, something to do after supper when there was no money for anything else. Brown sugar, molasses, butter, a splash of vinegar, water, cooked together in a heavy pot until a drop in cold water cracked clean between the fingers. That was the test. Not a thermometer because most kitchens didn't have one. If it cracked, you poured the batch onto a buttered plate and waited. Then you pulled it. 2 people, one end each, stretching and folding and stretching again, working air into the mass until it lightened from dark amber to pale gold and went glossy and stiff. Cut with scissors into pieces. Let it harden. The children got to pull, which meant they got to stay up late on Saturday, which was the actual point of the whole exercise. Nobody needed a recipe because the knowledge lived in the hands. When the hands are gone, the knowledge goes with them. Few dishes better capture the ingenuity of Depression-era cooks than bologna and rice casserole, an inventive marriage of modest ingredients that was both filling and budget-friendly. Rice was cheap, available nearly everywhere, and could stretch even the most limited pantries, while bologna, well, let's just say it wasn't winning culinary awards, but it certainly scored high marks for affordability and accessibility. Interestingly, the casserole's popularity was boosted by the era's government relief programs, which often provided surplus bologna to struggling families. Ever-resourceful home cooks quickly realized the processed meat's potential, combining thin slices or chopped bits with rice, canned tomatoes, and occasionally leftover vegetables lurking in their ice boxes, expertly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians point out that clever homemakers might dress up this casserole by layering in spices or sneaking in leftover cheese, a creative touch born purely from necessity. A running joke at dinner tables was that bologna and rice casserole was the great equalizer. Since wealthy or poor, no one was immune from the economic pinch, and apparently bologna didn't discriminate either. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Bacon grease saved in tins was a quiet pillar of Depression-era cooking. Every time bacon hit the pan, the drippings were poured into an old coffee can or mason jar, waiting to be used again. That grease-flavored beans, fried eggs, popped popcorn, and even baked into cornbread. Nothing was wasted. The fat added a smoky depth that plain oil or lard could not match. It solidified into a creamy spread when cooled and was sometimes smeared on bread in place of butter. In homes where every penny counted, that little tin by the stove was a lifeline. You measured it carefully, used it sparingly, and appreciated every spoonful. Even the smell of it heating up in the pan signaled that something good was coming. Saving bacon grease was not just a habit, it was a system of flavor preservation, one that turned scraps into satisfaction and made basic meals taste bold. Vinegar pie carried the tang of desperation transformed into something surprisingly delicious on Depression Christmas tables. When lemons were impossible to afford and fruit fillings remained a distant memory, families discovered that plain white vinegar could provide the tartness needed for a satisfying custard pie. The filling combined vinegar with sugar, eggs, butter, and flour, creating a custard that baked into something resembling lemon pie without the expense of citrus. The taste was sharp and sweet, with a silky texture that fooled many into thinking real fruit had been used. Mothers baked these pies in the same tins their grandmothers had used, continuing traditions even when ingredients changed. Children ate their slices without complaint, grateful for any dessert on the holiday table. The recipe required nothing beyond basic pantry staples, making it accessible to even the poorest households. Vinegar pie taught that substitution was not defeat, but creativity, proving Christmas dessert could survive any hardship. No Depression-era cook worth their salt would let good pickle brine go to waste, especially when flavoring was scarce and budgets tighter than the pickle jar lid. Thus, from humble kitchens emerged pickle soup, a tangy, resourceful dish blending leftover pickle juice, humble root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, and whatever pantry scraps happened to be available. Often thickened slightly with flour or potato starch, cooks could make this broth-based soup surprisingly filling without spending extra pennies. During an era when vinegar and spices were costly luxuries, leftover pickle juice became culinary gold, supplying robust flavor without extra expense. Clever substitutions like garden herbs or diced pickles replaced pricier seasonings, demonstrating Depression cooks' incredible ingenuity. Though today's diners might initially cringe at sipping pickle-flavored broth, the soup had a devoted following in communities with Eastern European heritage, where dill pickles reigned supreme and sour flavors were embraced wholeheartedly. Its tart profile even served as a comforting, affordable winter staple, beloved for its warmth and nutrient-rich ingredients like vitamin-filled veggies that prevented scurvy during harsh times. So, a way of repurposing things and adding fillers was using all kinds of leftovers. This was a pretty vital method of making your food supplies last longer. Those scraps had a lot of value in them because if you piled enough of them together, they definitely made more than a plate or two. Sometimes, you had enough going on in there to make an entirely new dish. People even made casseroles out of leftover scraps of ham, sausages, or beef, potatoes, and breadcrumbs. Faux food and mock food, like using mushrooms to imitate meat-based dishes and using leftover vegetables to add as a filling, were also really common. When people were done with a bird or animal, they would typically keep the bones because it was a great way to enrich your soup a little. That's the same way people began to get rid of stale bread and vegetables that were spoiling too. It was actually something that people theorized made their immune systems tougher. But I think that's just a folk myth. If anything, that would make your immune system more vulnerable, but you have to give credit where it's due. People were nothing if not resourceful during then. Speaking of casserole, this one's a mouthful to say, but trust me, it's worth the effort. Neo-Life. Nest dehydrated stroganoff casserole was this pre-made mix that just needed water added to it so you could get rid of that icky dehydration part of the whole deal. I get why they did it because canned food that can't last is like a fish that can't swim. Kind of redundant, so it's all right. Plus, this thing always gets a pass for how close it actually came to imitating the flavor of a real casserole made from scratch. You had a creamy, beefy stroganoff cassie, which you could obviously tell is processed, but for what it was worth, which was just $1 or $2, and the amount of value you got out of it, nobody was complaining about a little bit of a powdery aftertaste. Stroganoff is definitely something that was more popular in their time, though. Have you eaten much of it, or is it something you regularly get a plate of? I think if you had to circle out and pick one specific dish that best shows the kind of mentality people were under every day during the Great Depression, you would pick water pie. The name itself shows you how frugal this dish really is, and it's pretty true to the branding too. It just takes water, flour, and sugar, and if available, you can use butter and vanilla extract. A lot of people took notes out of mock food culture, which itself was a product of the Depression. People would try to make imitations of actual popular dishes, but since the ingredients were never available for them, and usually the goal was to make something that could feed the entire family, imitations using inferior ingredients or substitutes became popular. This pie didn't even really need eggs and milk, and it showed just how much people were willing to make do with whatever they had, as long as they got some food. You just pour water into a pre-baked crust and then mix in pretty small amounts of the rest of the ingredients because you still want to be saving. The taste wasn't as strong as it could have been if people were a bit more generous, but for what it was worth and how much the ingredients were stretched, it did still taste amazing. It was more of a custard on the inside than a pie, but it was definitely a way to have a pie craving satisfied back then. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. But years before the desperation pies reached their peak, American kitchens had already worked out how to bake without eggs by turning to the pantry shelf. Applesauce cake traced back to colonial New England, where the apple harvest came once a year and home cooks stewed and strained it into sauce specifically to stand in for eggs and fat in baked goods meant to keep through winter. A World War I recipe called for no eggs and only 2 tablespoons of butter, applesauce doing all the binding work. By the Depression years, the recipe had been tested across 2 generations, and the women who made it knew exactly what they were doing. Flour, spices, a little oil, the sauce, dense, moist, kept well in a tin. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, raisins if you had them. Walnuts off the backyard tree if you didn't. Boxed spice cake mixes pushed it off the counter in the 1950s, and it quietly stopped appearing. Very few people under 60 know what it actually tastes like. Amid scarcity, Depression-era households leaned heavily on resourcefulness, turning even the simplest pantry staples into nutritious meals, leading directly to the rise in popularity of peanut butter bread. With just flour, peanut butter, sugar, and baking powder, home bakers concocted this hearty loaf, demonstrating remarkable creativity born from necessity. The affordability and accessibility of peanut butter played a significant role. By the 1930s, this creamy spread had transitioned from a health food for the wealthy into a cheap protein source for everyone. Interestingly, peanut butter bread required no yeast, a clever adaptation considering yeast was costly and sometimes unavailable, further reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians note that newspapers eagerly published this simple recipe, promoting it as the ultimate economical dish, sometimes even humorously suggesting peanut butter could single-handedly keep America strong. Many Depression survivors fondly remember slicing this loaf thinly, stretching its lifespan for days, or toasting stale slices for snacks, exemplifying an era when food waste was practically criminal. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes, because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Cornmeal mush slices were the breakfast that showed up twice. You would make a big pot of cornmeal mush, basically a thick porridge cooked with water and salt, and serve it hot for dinner or supper. But the real magic came the next morning. You would pour the leftovers into a pan, let them chill overnight, then slice them into thick rectangles and fry them in a little grease until crisp on the outside. What you got was something golden, crunchy, and soft in the middle, comfort food on a budget. Sometimes you would pour syrup or molasses over the top. Other times it went savory with a spoonful of beans or gravy. It was a blank slate, which made it a favorite in homes where ingredients were limited but routines were strong. You knew what you were getting. It was cheap, hearty, and filled the belly before a day of hard work. No one called it gourmet, but no one went hungry either. It taught families how to get 2 meals from one pot and how to turn yesterday's leftovers into today's ritual. That kind of thinking does not just save money. It builds resilience, one fried slice at a time. Cream-dried beef stretched a small amount of preserved meat into Christmas breakfast that felt almost luxurious during hard times. Dried beef, sold in small jars or packages at every general store, was one of the few meat products poor families could afford. The beef was torn into pieces and simmered in white sauce made from flour, butter, or bacon grease and milk, creating a savory gravy that was poured over toast or biscuits. The dish was salty and rich, with enough protein to sustain a family through Christmas morning activities. Some called it by its military nickname, but in family kitchens it was simply a way to make meat stretch further than it should. Children loved the creamy sauce and did not notice how little actual meat was present. The recipe required only pantry staples and a small investment in dried beef, making it accessible even in the worst years. Creamed dried beef turned scarcity into satisfaction, one ladleful at a time. Biscuits have long been staples at American dinner tables, but during the Great Depression, traditional wheat flour biscuits became luxuries families could rarely afford. Ingeniously, home cooks turned to cornmeal, cheap, filling, and abundantly available, to bake cornmeal biscuits with syrup, a comforting alternative that kept everyone satisfied. Cornmeal, originally a Native American staple, gained renewed popularity in the Depression, not only because it was economical, but also due to its nutritional value, providing essential fiber and vitamins at a fraction of the cost. With sugar scarce and expensive, resourceful cooks substituted molasses or homemade syrups to sweeten these biscuits, imparting a delightful caramelized flavor that elevated a simple meal into something special. Bakers cleverly blended modest amounts of wheat flour with cornmeal to keep texture tender without breaking tight budgets. Surprisingly, syrup-sweetened cornmeal biscuits became not only a side dish but also an occasional dessert, proving that versatility was indeed a Depression-era virtue. So, a big way that people ended up saving tons of money during the Great Depression was the concept of a victory garden. Basically, these are just tiny patches of land you use for cultivating and growing crops and vegetables in your backyard. The term victory garden comes from some wartime slang, but the gardens themselves were totally genius. It was getting very hard for Americans to shop for vegetables, especially since so many families were doing nothing but relying on basic crops to get by. Victory gardens gave all kinds of families an edge in the Depression because it let them grow a lot of different kinds of things for free. Not only did this mean that people had a source of food locked down, they also had a source of income. People could sell the things they grew in their gardens, or even rent the space out to others so that they could grow as well. Even the government was all for these gardens and regularly published resources that would help people understand how to grow and take care of one. It took a while before people were able to properly grow and maintain one, as no one's green thumb was really all that good, but eventually people got the hang of it and even retained the skill as a side hobby after things settled down. Many great things have come out of Alaska, but nothing beats the baked Alaska grandma would bring home on the weekends. If it doesn't ring a bell, let me jog up your memory really quickly. This dessert was made of ice cream placed in a pie dish, lined with slices of sponge cake or Christmas pudding and topped with meringue. Now, don't let the name fool you. This delicacy didn't really originate in Alaska. Yeah, it was made at the famous Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. The dessert was supposedly named Alaska, Florida, in 1867 to celebrate the United States purchase of Alaska from Russia, with the cold ice cream representing Alaska and the warm, baked meringue representing the sunny state of Florida. This one is known for its dramatic presentation. It was brought to the table aflame with a flambe. Many grandmas love to make baked Alaska for special occasions because of its wow factor. This dish actually got popular for exactly the reasons you would think. Yes, landing your man through a happy stomach is a good way to get married by fall season. Another really popular part of the Depression diet and appetite was how people really took to making dumplings. No, seriously. I know nowadays we go out for them and they cost an arm and a leg and you're like, but they're just dumplings? And I'm right on board with that train of thought. Back then though, you gotta understand, flour was in a different position. Well, everything was. Things hadn't become that expensive, though they were definitely massively unaffordable by the standards of the people who were living in those times. The way people got to making dumplings during the Depression was by actually making use of things like all-purpose flour and water. They would end up making serviceable enough dumplings, and they would actually be really good to make for special occasions, or when you wanted to give yourself a little treat after finally being able to spare one too. It meant that people were eating at least something they enjoyed. It wasn't popular in just communities that had traditions around dumpling making too, but those communities outstretched their hand and taught people all the tricks they could to make better ones. Community living was a real thing back then. It had to be. People were simply more resourceful in numbers. Apple cornbread crisps were another really popular way of incorporating apples into an ingredient that has lasted many families throughout many droughts. Cornmeal is a staple ingredient for a lot of reasons, but you can sum them up by saying that it's always been there whenever you've needed it most. The Great Depression brought back the culture of apples, especially in rural areas and places with heavy farming land like the South. This used cornmeal to make apple-flavored cornbread, which was actually a pretty comforting dish to eat given the circumstances and the options available at the time. You could kind of call it a hybrid between a cobbler and a fruit pie, as the cornbread crust and the soft, spicy apples underneath definitely give off that feeling. Nope. As you can probably tell, growing fruits and vegetables in your own backyard became an exceptionally important fact of life. One of the other things that people became very fond of growing on a regular basis were grapes, like Concord grapes. This was especially true when you went over to areas like New York and the Midwest, which had a lot of strong potential soil-wise for home grapevines and grapeyards. When fresh veggies were hard to come by, this simple, affordable dish made its way onto many kitchen tables. Creamed peas on toast. Yuck! Sounds terrible to me, but maybe some of you will disagree. In hard times, this was the go-to meal for families looking for something hearty without draining the pantry. Canned peas, some butter, flour, and milk, and you had yourself a creamy sauce that could turn a humble slice of toast into a meal. I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but creamed peas on toast were the purest form of comfort. You didn't need fancy ingredients or hours of prep time. Toss the peas in a quick white sauce, pour it over toast, and voila, dinner is served. It was filling and warm, with just the right amount of creamines to make you forget that it was actually a can of peas and a piece of toast. Creamed peas on toast came with a great bonus. It was quick to prepare, making it ideal for those nights when you were hungry but didn't have much to work with. It won't win you any culinary awards, but creamed peas on toast was a no-fuss comfort food that got the job done. If bread pudding fed a crowd without fuss, oatmeal lace cookies were the kind that made people stop mid-conversation and look at what they were holding. Nothing like a regular oatmeal cookie. Rolled paper-thin from oats, butter, brown sugar, and a little flour, they spread flat and baked into caramelized wafers barely 1/8 of an inch thick, almost transparent at the edges. They shattered when you bit them and left a faint film of caramel on your fingers. You baked 2 to a sheet because they spread so far, and you had to lift them while still warm. Wait too long and they snapped. A church social staple through the 1930s and 40s, the kind that went on the good plate next to the good china. Snowdrift shortening spread versions through community cookbooks across the country. She made dozens every December, stored between sheets of waxed paper, and rationed them. You were never allowed more than 2 at a time. She knew exactly how many were left. When fresh meat vanished from dinner tables during the Great Depression, clever home cooks across America transformed simple staples into meals that were both satisfying and surprisingly sophisticated. One dish that embodied this culinary ingenuity was spaghetti with butter and garlic, a modest yet flavorful creation championed for its affordability and accessibility. Pasta was cheap, garlic bulbs grew easily in backyard gardens, and butter was often the only indulgence that squeezed through tight household budgets, making this meal the perfect ally during financial hardship. But here's a little-known historical gem. Many immigrant families introduced this garlic-infused comfort using recipes carried from European homelands and creatively adapted due to economic necessity. Leftover spaghetti was often intentionally cooked in larger batches to reuse the next day, thereby cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Housewives humorously called it the gourmet dish without the gourmet budget, noting that despite its humble ingredients, it carried an air of Mediterranean flair. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Breadcrumb coffee cake topping was a clever twist born from necessity and sweet tooth cravings. Butter was a luxury and store-bought streusel was a fantasy, so people turned to the one thing they had plenty of: old bread. Dried out and crumbled into coarse bits, it became the base for a topping that could rival anything from the bakery. You mix the crumbs with sugar and leftover grease, bacon fat, lard, or even schmaltz, and scattered the mix over simple batter before baking. The result was a sweet, savory crust that crisped up beautifully and added texture to every bite. It did not melt like butter would, but it crunched and it clung to the top like a golden halo. Kids loved the crispy bits, and adults appreciated that nothing went to waste. You could season it with cinnamon or nutmeg if those were on hand, but even plain, it worked. It gave plain cakes a little flair, made breakfasts feel fancy, and helped turn the most basic ingredients into something memorable. That topping was resourcefulness baked right in. Cornmeal mush served as Christmas breakfast for countless families who had little else to start the holiday morning. Ground corn was the cheapest grain available during the Depression, costing mere pennies for enough to feed a family for days. The mush was made by slowly stirring cornmeal into boiling water, cooking it until the mixture thickened into a porridge that was both filling and warming. Served hot in deep bowls with molasses drizzled over the top, it provided the energy children needed before the excitement of whatever small Christmas celebrations awaited. Some families added a splash of milk when they could afford it, making the dish slightly richer and more satisfying. The texture was smooth and comforting, the corn flavor honest and familiar. Cornmeal mush represented the absolute basics of survival cooking, yet it carried warmth and nourishment that more expensive foods could not match. For families with nothing else, this simple porridge was Christmas morning itself. In the 1930s, even a simple vegetable like celery became the unlikely hero of Depression-era meals. Creamed celery over toast, a humble yet surprisingly popular dish, epitomized how clever cooks transformed economical ingredients into filling comfort food. Celery, inexpensive and versatile, was gently simmered in a basic white sauce, usually crafted from pantry staples like flour, milk, or even broth when dairy was scarce. Creative homemakers sometimes stretched this sauce further with leftover bacon grease or diluted evaporated milk, showcasing remarkable ingenuity when luxury ingredients were distant memories. Poured generously over toasted stale bread, a strategic use of otherwise wasted leftovers, this creamy concoction ensured families stayed full, even if wallets remained empty. Interestingly, celery wasn't merely affordable. It provided valuable vitamins and dietary fiber, critical when balanced nutrition seemed like an impossible goal. Although today celery rarely stars in main dishes, Depression-era potluck tables proudly featured it front and center, proving even the humblest veggies could achieve culinary fame. Yet another way people would stretch out supplies and make sure that any and all shopping trips were avoided: repurposing items, janky, rusted tools, break them down into cutters or glue them together and make it work. Use that shoe with a hole in it, the one that's missing a few laces too. Take a sack of feed and cut it. You can use the cloth. Don't let any thread, needle, or clip go to waste. Learn to sew, because it's going to save your life. Repurpose any kind of cloth you can find into skirts, sweaters, scarves, curtains, or anything that means you don't have to spend more on unnecessary things. Any money people had was something they could only afford to spend on food, nothing else. Lots of families typically just lived off of hand-me-downs, especially ones with big sibling populations. The ones that didn't have those, it became common for families to move in with each other and survive the drought together. This meant that their wardrobes would get recycled too. Old furniture was another gold mine for resourceful families. Broken chairs were transformed into firewood or stripped for parts to repair other items. Even worn-out bedding found a second life. Mattresses were restuffed with anything soft, from old fabric scraps to straw. Glass jars were cleaned and reused to store everything from preserved foods to sewing supplies. Families also salvaged buttons, zippers, and patches from torn clothes to mend others, ensuring nothing was discarded if it had potential use. Now, who could ever forget Campbell's soup? This is a household staple if I've ever heard of one, and it's a pretty magical thing when you think about it from the boomer's perspective. Today, we're spoiled. Let's face it, we are. We walk up to a store and get anything we want packaged, canned, or frozen. But all these goodies started somewhere, and Campbell's Soup was one of the most popular and long-lasting brands to do it. It had this condensed soup that just needed water or milk added and came in accessible flavors like cream of mushroom, chicken noodle, and tomato. The range with this thing was insane. Did you know you could even use this soup as the base for a casserole or as its sauce? And all that for just 10 to 12 cents. Pretty good steal, right? Considering it wasn't just a meal, it was a lifesaver for busy moms and a comforting staple for families during tough times. The iconic red and white can became a symbol of good food, finding a place in nearly every pantry. Campbell's ads even taught clever recipes like turning cream of mushroom soup into a creamy pasta sauce or a gravy for meatloaf. Another thing that people did that really got some traction was that they began to use bones in their broths. The entire point behind using bones in your broths was that they were full of nutrition and actually added a lot of flavor to your overall broth. They made for cheap seasonings and were a pretty resourceful way to get some extra nutrition in your broth. During the Depression, people changed from throwing away leftover chicken and wings with a bit of nasty chunks of meat on them to consuming just about every single thing that was attached to an animal. Bones were no exception, and these bone broths were almost instrumental in surviving the winter for lots of people. Though they never fixed people's problems, they definitely didn't make them any worse either. People would often even reuse bones in broths instead of it just being like a one-and-done situation. So what do you think people did with the bread that was left over? Besides using stale bread in imaginative ways such as pudding and porridge, it meant that people used breadcrumbs as fillers too. This was helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, breadcrumbs actually make for an excellent binding agent. They're super good at holding the meat together, and this was necessary for more than a few reasons. You start making these makeshift meatloaves with limited ingredients, and you realize they actually don't hold together that well. Secondly, lots of the things that gave meatloaves their moisture were things like eggs, milk, and a good broth. Of course, milk and eggs were in direly short supply for most households in America during the Depression. Adding breadcrumbs was a way for your meatloaf to still keep some kind of moisture. Also, during the process, breadcrumbs would eventually soften and give the meatloaf a better texture overall. It meant that you only had stale bread without the crumbs, and now you're also going to be having meatloaf with it. Pretty good deal, right? One of the most widely consumed ingredients in the entire Great Depression was potato. This star quarterback of a vegetable saved so many people's weekly dinner plans, it's really not even funny. Potatoes could also be homegrown, and with the Depression, a concept known as backyard gardening became a thing. People used to grow crops in their backyards wherever they could, either to keep getting new food that didn't cost anything or to sell it for other stuff. One of the best ones to grow was a potato because you could make anything out of it, like potato donuts. These were even store-bought, and they were still really cheap. Think of them like soft, starchy, melt-in-your-mouth donuts made out of mashed potatoes. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in? A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. Vinegar pie belonged to a category depression cooks called desperation pies, shells filled with something other than fruit when fruit was gone and money was scarcer. White or cider vinegar, sugar, flour, butter, sometimes an egg if you had one, mixed smooth and poured into an unbaked shell. Baked until set and barely jiggly at the center. What came out was a tart sweet custard with the texture of chess pie, soft and clean and worth a second slice. The vinegar pulled back from its sharpness in the heat and left something that tasted closer to lemon than anything acidic, which was the entire point. Lemon was expensive and sometimes unavailable. Vinegar was always in the house. You never said what was in it before they tasted it. If you did, they put down their fork. If you didn't, they asked for the recipe. The difference between a depression cook and everyone else was knowing which secrets to keep until after dessert. While egg drop soup might evoke images of your favorite Chinese takeout, Depression-era Americans had their own inventive take on this classic dish. When times got tough and wallets got thinner, families turned to an American-style egg drop soup, cleverly crafted from simple ingredients that were affordable and accessible. Usually it was nothing more than broth, often just salted water, if we're honest, with a single precious egg carefully beaten and slowly drizzled into the simmering liquid. The egg stretched surprisingly far, forming delicate ribbons that turned plain broth into something more substantial. Food historians note that cooks, driven by creativity born from necessity, occasionally enhanced the soup by sneaking in leftover vegetables or even stale bread crusts, brilliantly reducing waste and maximizing resources. There's even an old joke from the era. Families humorously called it egg drop soup because that's exactly what they did. Drop in one egg, cross their fingers, and hope nobody noticed the absence of meat. Despite its humble composition, the warm broth offered important nutrients and protein, essential during a time when these were scarce. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Dandelion greens boil was not a fancy recipe, it was pure necessity pulled from the dirt. When grocery shelves were bare and even vegetables became hard to find, people looked to their backyards and roadsides. Dandelions, often treated like weeds, suddenly became dinner. You had to pick them young, before they flowered, or the bitterness would be too much. Then you boiled them once to soften the fibers, drained them, and boiled them again to cut down the sharp taste. After that, you could sauté them in leftover bacon fat, toss them with vinegar, or serve them over toast if you were lucky. The result was earthy, tangy, and surprisingly good once you got used to it. It filled your stomach, gave you greens when none were growing in the market, and brought something fresh into a diet that mostly came from tins. Children might have wrinkled their noses, but grown-ups knew the value. Foraging became a quiet revolution. It reminded people that the land could still provide, even when the stores could not. And when a bowl of boiled greens kept your family going for another day, that weed in the yard started to look a whole lot like grace. Milk toast offered comfort to families who had little more than bread and dairy for Christmas breakfast. Day-old bread was toasted until golden, then placed in bowls and covered with warm milk that had been sweetened slightly with sugar and perhaps flavored with a drop of vanilla. The toast softened in the milk, creating something between cereal and bread pudding that was both filling and soothing. For sick children or elderly family members, milk toast was especially valued as gentle nourishment that went down easily. The dish cost almost nothing, yet delivered warmth and sustenance that more expensive foods could not surpass. Families gathered around the table to eat their bowls of softened toast, grateful for milk when many had none. Milk toast was simple to the point of seeming too plain, yet it carried comfort that transcended its humble ingredients. It was Christmas breakfast for those who measured wealth in warmth rather than abundance. During the Great Depression, vegetables like carrots and potatoes were kitchen VIPs, not because of glamour, but sheer affordability and availability. The humble yet flavorful carrot and potato bake, a casserole of thinly sliced potatoes combined with brightly grated carrots, became a potluck favorite precisely because it cleverly stretched ingredients without sacrificing nutrition or taste. To keep budgets intact, thrifty cooks relied on simple additions like flour, thickened milk, or leftover broth instead of costly cream, and seasoned it sparingly with homegrown herbs or scraps of onion, turning basic veggies into something delightfully savory. Interestingly, carrots, high in vitamin A, gained popularity during tough economic times, not only because they were cheap, but they also boosted nutrition at a time when balanced diets seemed harder than balancing checkbooks. Potato slices baked tenderly alongside carrots delivered comforting carbs and vital nutrients, creating an unexpectedly hearty dish without meat or expensive dairy. Families attending potluck gatherings eagerly welcomed casseroles like this, a nutritious yet inexpensive way to ensure everyone left the dinner full, even if wallets stayed empty. In pretty much the exact same way, you must be familiar with all the kinds of things people are doing to save costs by making repairs at home now. Not just things like stitching yourself up or sewing your own clothes and patching the odd hole or two. People would even reuse buttons and zippers or make use of furniture that was clearly long past its life. People would reupholster it so that it would last longer. It was common for drapes and sofas to really suffer some wear and tear throughout their stay at most people's homes. People learned to use staple guns and glue. They learned their way around a hammer. And they learned how to repair things like irons and radios too. Take apart one with a screwdriver, get the soldering iron out, and get to work. Honestly, your average Joe became something of a smith himself during the whole thing. One of the bestest friends the American masses made during this, things that people really cherished. Time was duct tape, twine, string, and anything else that worked as a Band-Aid fix were. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. People have found lots of different ways to use coffee grounds. But remember when I said they saved theirs and relied on chicory for brewing? Yeah, the other thing they did to make those supplies last longer than they had any right to naturally was reusing coffee grounds. So, coffee grounds had a lot of uses outside of just brewing. Once you made your cup of coffee, their use in that regard ran out, but that didn't mean you couldn't do anything more with it. If you actually take a look at what makes up a coffee ground, you'll find that it's really loaded with nitrogen. Plant growth in particular is something that deeply requires a lot of nitrogen to be successful. What was it that people got around to doing and doubled down on during the Depression? Oh, that's right, farming. Victory gardens in the cities and full-on farming in the rural areas. Coffee grounds were being used far and wide for how good they were at stimulating plant growth and helping the soil gain some of its spark back. Additionally, they killed 2 bugs with 1 harvest. You could fortify your soil while also ensuring that the scent of the coffee ground worked as a pest repellent, which it really did. In this time, animals were also migrating into areas they weren't used to avoid the effects of the bowl and the general chaos the country was in. They also took notice of all the new plants and really tried to get in there and mess them up. That's why people found so much use for these grounds even after they got their caffeine hit. I don't know if you've ever heard of a 3-ingredient cake, but a Pennsylvania Dutch funny cake is exactly that. It was one of the cakes that was known for its thriftiness and resourcefulness. It took next to nothing to make, only needing chocolate or molasses syrup and an unbaked pie crust. If you had any kind of flour or flour substitute and cocoa powder, that would work too. It was a bit of a celebratory dish at that time, since this one actually did take typical baking ingredients, but the result was worth it. It was a great cake to have on a budget, and it lasted a lot of households, giving them sugar rushes when they desperately needed them more than anything else in the day to survive. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. Lazy Daisy cake showed up in so many community cookbooks through the 1930s that food historian Ann Byrne found 7 nearly identical versions in a single collection, all tracing to snowdrift, shortening advertisements, and newspaper columns that women clipped and traded and tucked into recipe boxes for 2 generations. The cake was a simple oatmeal butter cake baked in a square pan. The frosting was the thing. Brown sugar, butter, cream, and shredded coconut spread raw across the warm cake straight from the oven, then slid under the broiler for 30 seconds. Not a minute, never a minute, because it went from golden to scorched in the time it took to look away. What came out was a caramelized coconut crust over a soft oat cake, warm and served straight from the pan. You've probably never had it. Your great-grandmother made it at least twice a month and thought nothing of it. The recipes that felt ordinary to the people who made them are always the hardest ones to get back. When empty stomachs and lean wallets collided, innovative cooking blossomed across American kitchens. One standout born from this economic squeeze was Hoover Stew, a tongue-in-cheek homage to President Herbert Hoover, whose name, during tough times, humorously became synonymous with empty pockets. The stew cleverly combined cheap hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and any stray veggies lurking in pantry corners, exemplifying creativity born from necessity. This simple yet hearty recipe embodied affordability and accessibility, as families everywhere could easily scrounge up its ingredients. Fascinatingly, cooks often swapped in leftovers, stale bread, wilting greens, or bits of onion, masterfully reducing waste and maximizing resources. Despite its humble origins, Hoover Stew was surprisingly flavorful, with the acidic tomatoes enhancing the smoky saltiness of hot dogs, making families forget, at least momentarily, the scarcity around their dinner table. Though it was called a stew, it often turned into a thicker, casserole-like dish, leading many housewives to jokingly rename it Hoover Surprise. No matter how much you stirred it, you'd never find prosperity at the bottom of the pot, just another spoonful of macaroni. Homemade crackers were one of the simplest yet most practical foods people baked during the Depression. With store-bought crackers and snacks out of the question, families turned to flour, water, and a pinch of salt or lard to make thin crisps. Rolled flat and baked until golden, they provided crunch and variety in a diet that was otherwise dominated by soft, starchy foods. Often, children would snack on them plain, while adults used them to stretch soups, broths, and thin stews. They could be topped with whatever was on hand, from drippings to a smear of carrot marmalade, but even alone they were satisfying in their simplicity. Families appreciated how they required little fuel and ingredients, and they became a staple for households that could not afford bread every day. Homemade crackers reflected resilience, showing how even the most basic pantry items could be transformed into something useful. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, which is exactly what people needed most. Rolled crust pie toppers were the sweet finish made from scraps. In a time when nothing could go to waste, not even leftover pastry, cooks got creative. The ends of pie dough were rolled thin, brushed with a little water or drippings, sprinkled with sugar or cinnamon, and baked until crisp. That was your treat. It did not take much. A warm oven, a spare minute, and a bit of imagination. These little crisps were handed out to children like cookies or set on the table with tea as a quiet dessert. Some people curled them into spirals, others cut them into strips, but the goal was the same: stretch the dough, stretch the joy. You did not need filling or fruit, just flour, fat, and whatever flavor you could scrape together. And in that act of rolling and baking scraps, there was something quietly beautiful. It turned waste into something warm. It reminded folks that even the edges mattered, and it made a house smell like home, even if there was no pie underneath. Sometimes the crust was the best part, and during the Depression it was often the only part, so people made it count, every flaky bite. Navy bean soup simmered on Christmas Eve in homes across America, filling kitchens with savory aroma that promised nourishment for the holiday. Dried navy beans were soaked overnight, then cooked slowly with whatever flavoring the family could afford. A ham bone saved from better times, a piece of salt pork, or simply onion and salt. The beans broke down into creamy richness during the long cooking, creating a soup that was both filling and satisfying. Families ladled it over cornbread or served it alongside biscuits made from flour and lard, creating complete meals from ingredients that cost almost nothing. The soup could feed a family for days, with leftovers reheated for Christmas dinner and the meals that followed. Children grew up associating the smell of simmering beans with holiday memories, not realizing until later how little their parents had spent. Navy bean soup was survival made delicious, proving that protein and comfort could come from the humblest sources. When family budgets tightened dramatically during the Depression, barley, once considered animal feed, stepped onto American dinner tables as an affordable, nourishing staple. The barley and tomato casserole, a hearty yet humble dish, combined economical barley grains with tangy tomatoes, creating a filling meal out of ingredients previously overlooked or underrated. Home cooks showcased remarkable resourcefulness by swapping out expensive meats with barley's chewy, filling texture, enhanced by canned or fresh garden tomatoes simmered into flavorful sauces. Interestingly, barley wasn't just cheap. It provided valuable dietary fiber and nutrients, making it a healthier option in tough times. If tomatoes ran short, resourceful cooks substituted home-canned tomato juice or even diluted ketchup, highlighting creativity under pressure. Though admittedly, the ketchup option probably raised some skeptical eyebrows at potluck dinners. While barley may not have won culinary glamour points, it earned respect as a sturdy and reliable pantry staple, helping households avoid hunger when pricier grains were beyond reach. This casserole's presence at community gatherings represented more than just sustenance. It symbolized the era's determination to stretch ingredients creatively without sacrificing nourishment or taste. If you didn't know, it was actually common enough for people to even use the clothes that still weren't fit for any kind of furniture or clothing for insulation instead. If you didn't have that, or if you didn't have enough of it, people would instead just use straws around their homes to help keep them warm. Straw worked naturally as an insulation. Making a straw bale and constructing lots of them became a daily practice for people during the Depression, and it helped to give pretty decent insulation for how cheap it was too. Once you layer straw, it only gets warmer from there. With fabric, people could often sew it up to create makeshift blockages for any kind of draft or hole where windows and doors may be. You didn't want the cold air coming in, and lots of people had childhood blankets and clothes they never used or had no one to give them away to either. In a sense, people who lived in homes without a lot of brothers and sisters were probably better off in this regard. They didn't need to pass their clothes on to anyone, so all of the ones they couldn't use could go to this instead. Then, there was the idea of making padding with fabric and straw as well. It helped to keep homes warmer, and people would often stuff their walls with it. People would also make blankets and line the walls with them too, and little things like these piled up to make a noticeable difference in the temperature. Throughout the Depression, the war, and every little bit of chaos after, canned bread was a constant friend, ally, and supporter of the American people. This dense, sweet, and spongy bread used to get that way thanks to a neat little trick known as steaming before canning, which really helped it retain that airy, sponge-like texture. This was used in war for soldiers as a part of government rations, and even organizations like the Red Cross would have it during many of their food drives. For just 20 or 25 cents, you could get some pretty decent bread, and the entire idea of this was to market how practical and convenient it is. I gotta say, it worked because people bought it in droves. Seriously, go ask your mom and dad about how much people used to get canned bread back in the day and how it was used for rations. They pretty much paired it with things like Campbell's soup or used it as a side for other dishes that involved bread. Not everybody even had an oven back then, and in an era with an increasing focus on hustling and grinding your way into a nice little retirement, the appeal of baking bread from scratch for a few hours wasn't really something people were too into. Around the time the Depression was really active, from the entire decade, powdered milk was such an essential go-to meal for people that it was impossible to not live without it. People did not have access to dairy, and I mean this as a fact of life. Nobody was drinking milk, like ever. You'd think something like that would be one thing the government could at least take care of, but God forbid you get your taxes worth, right? Anyway, powdered milk was at least a lot more competent than the two-party system at the time. Fresh milk had to be downed really quickly. Weren't feeling it? Just forgot? Too full? Too bad. If you don't want that bottle of precious, God-fearing milk to go to waste, you better buckle up and chug. Yet living like that sounds awfully exhausting when you pile on everything else people had to worry about, you know? It wasn't like that with powdered milk. No sir, this thing, you could just leave it in a cool little cabinet, not see it for months, pick it up, and get to work. Plus, most homes didn't have any kind of refrigeration, and this made issues of storage even worse for people. It was impossible to get by without relying on things like this. Chocolate potato cakes were probably the best example of ingenuity as a result of a crisis. Who would have ever thought that mashed potatoes and chocolate could go together in a cake of all things? I couldn't come up with that with a gun to my head, and these people had bills to theirs instead, which is twice the pressure. If you look back into American cooking practices, though, using potatoes as a way to make the cake base more firm and dense was a common practice, and when other things like flour and thickening agents weren't available, this was due. Cocoa powder was also a lot easier to get than chocolate bars, so it took care of flavoring the cake pretty easily. One of the other rarer ways people got to baking cakes was to use potatoes as a base instead, and now you can probably see that I really wasn't exaggerating when I said that people used potatoes to get by. They made almost everything they could out of potatoes, and this cake used chocolate layers on top of a potato base to create a pretty comforting dessert that could pass around the entire family. Despite what you might think, the chocolate flavor was actually pretty noticeable and deep, and the potato flavor was barely noticeable. It felt and tasted much closer to a real cake than people would imagine. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, it stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. Nobody wrote it down. That was the whole point. If you had to look it up, you weren't ready to make it. Cornstarch pudding was cornstarch and sugar stirred dry in a pot. Then boiling water poured in slow while you whisked hard to keep out lumps, held over heat until the mixture thickened and went clear. If there was milk, you used milk and got something closer to a creamy blancmange. If there was no milk, you used water and it still set up smooth and clean and faintly sweet. Vanilla at the end if you had it. Nutmeg on top if you had that. Rita Van Amber documented it in her book on Depression cooking from the 1930s. 3 ingredients, cooked together, served cold. The women who made it called it dessert and meant it. They made it for sick children who needed something gentle. They made it when the pantry was spoken for everywhere else. The spoon scraped the bowl clean every time. Cabbage coleslaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Eggless mayonnaise might sound like a contradiction, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver. Real eggs were expensive and risky to store without refrigeration, so resourceful cooks found another way. The trick involved boiling flour, sugar, vinegar, water, and a little mustard powder into a thick paste, then whisking in oil slowly as it cooled. The result was creamy, tangy, and just firm enough to mimic the real thing. It was used in potato salads, sandwiches, and anywhere a dollop of mayo was needed. While it lacked the richness of yolks, it held its own in terms of flavor and texture. It was cheap, safe to keep, and easy to make with pantry staples. Some versions added condensed milk for sweetness or lemon juice for brightness. Others were purely savory. It was not gourmet, but it made a humble lunch feel more complete. And for families trying to make the most of what little they had, eggless mayo turned barely enough into just right. Water pie was the desperate dessert that turned almost nothing into something sweet enough for Christmas dinner. When families could not afford eggs, milk, butter, or fruit, this pie emerged from sheer necessity and stubborn determination to have dessert on the holiday table. The filling was astonishingly simple: water, sugar, flour, vanilla, and small amount of butter mixed together and poured into a pie crust. During baking, the mixture transformed into custard-like filling that was surprisingly satisfying. The pie had other names in different regions: Depression pie, Desperation pie, names carrying the weight of era's hardship. Children eating this pie often never knew how little it contained, only that mother had made them Christmas dessert. The crust could be made from lard and flour, ingredients even the poorest pantries usually held. Water pie represented the absolute bottom of Depression experience, yet also represented triumph, love and determination, creating celebration from virtually nothing at all. Back in the Depression, tossing apple peels in the trash was practically unthinkable. Those scraps were culinary gold for resourceful cooks, who transformed them into apple peel jelly, a clever, sweet treat that stretched household budgets further than a politician's promises. Homemakers combined leftover peels, cores, and even bruised apple bits with water, boiling them into a flavorful liquid before adding sugar and simmering the mixture until it thickened naturally, often without expensive store-bought pectin. Ingeniously, cooks sometimes enhanced this homemade jelly with lemon juice or vinegar as affordable substitutes to mimic pricey commercial preservatives, ensuring it remained fresh and bright-tasting. Apple peels contain natural pectin. Who knew leftovers had built-in magic? So the jelly set beautifully without extra costs. Historically significant beyond simple economy, preserving fruits through homemade jellies allowed families to enjoy essential vitamins and sweetness long after harvest seasons ended. During Depression-era potlucks, Bringing jars of this delicate rosy-hued jelly symbolized not poverty, but creativity and pride, turning frugal kitchens into tiny workshops of culinary art. Remember how I said victory gardens were a good source of income? They weren't just that. These gardens helped for another reason, one unique to the Depression. This was the return of the bartering system. It became extremely common to barter for any kind of good or service since money didn't really have the same value, nor was it something people had, honestly. Whatever money they did have, they would save for official places like grocery marts and markets, where that was the only way they could buy things. Amongst each other, people started to barter. They would trade the things they grew in their victory gardens, and two of the easiest things to grow and really popular to trade were potatoes and tomatoes. They could go with just about anything, and all kinds of soups and stews used them. Then people would trade their hand-me-downs, basic kitchen tools, a shoelace, some soles, basically anything and everything that would mean you wouldn't have to waste money on repairs or buy something new when you could make what you have last just a bit longer. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Who were alive back then, though, they were literally adding in potato peels to their broths and stews. It was said that they were really good in regards to the amount of fiber they have. Have you ever had a conversation where a gym bro went off on you about micros and macros? You may have heard them mention fiber a lot. While I'm sorry for your wasted time if you've experienced that, I must say, they do have a point too. Fiber helps you be full for much longer and decreases your appetite. People were taking in everything they could to keep their appetites low, really. It's no wonder smoking became such a working-class-related phenomenon during this time in America's history. One of the best ways for sustenance during this entire fiasco was easily corn. Cornmeal, in specific, was really helpful for the masses. This is because corn was one of the few crops that America could grow native to its own soil. It was also one of the few crops that was not experiencing massive amounts of failure during harvest. I really can't stress how bad this time was for the land as well, not just the people. The Dust Bowl was something that left all kinds of consequences on the face of the country. Crops seriously were never ever growing. People were trying to find their green thumb and get something going in victory gardens, which is a whole other concept we'll talk about later. But it wasn't really working. Cornmeal was the perfect thing to rely on for many reasons. First, you didn't run into these kinds of issues when you were making some simple cornmeal. Second, if you couldn't grow it because you just didn't live near any regions that had fertile land or were from the places struck by the bowl, then you could buy it for dirt cheap. Third of all, and this is the real kicker, there are actual detailed documents the size of mini novels that show you all the different kinds of recipes you can make with cornmeal. It also really helped that most of these recipes were really easy to make and adaptable to what you had on hand too. If you still remember, a while ago I mentioned how much love canned fruits had been receiving both as a concept and a practical part of everyday life. They even became something of a lifeline during the Depression because they were some of the most popularly distributed items you could get from government relief efforts or organizations. As a result, people started making dishes that made full use of all kinds of salads. Things like frozen fruit salads used all the canned fruits available, usually pineapples, oranges, cherries, or something like bananas, and then mixed them with mayonnaise or cream, eventually freezing them in molds in the final step. If available, a bit of sugar and marshmallow was also used for extra sweetness, but I wouldn't rely on most homes to have marshmallows back then. Anyway, this was a cheap and easy salad you could prepare in bulk that also gave the family a shot of some much-needed nutrition. Homemade meatloaf, the best-kept secret for stretching a small amount of meat into a full meal. In hard times, buying enough ground beef for the whole family was a challenge, to say the least. But meatloaf came to the rescue. That makes it sound like a superhero. But in a way, it was. The trick was to add breadcrumbs, oats, or whatever filler you had in the house, mix it all up, and you've got yourself a meal that could feed many. Meatloaf was a sort of blank canvas for creative chefs. You could toss in onions, ketchup, or mustard, plus you could top it off with the famous ketchup glaze. The end result was a meal that felt satisfying, even though you'd sneakily cut the meat with cheaper ingredients. The beauty of meatloaf was that no two recipes were ever the same. Each household had its own version, depending on what they had in the pantry. And let's not forget the most important part, the leftovers. They were good the next day too. Some would say even better. You could slice it up for sandwiches or reheat it for another dinner. It was a comfort food at its finest. Cheap, simple, budget-friendly, and packed with flavor, so you forgot what it actually was. Sugar cream pie, sometimes called Hoosier pie, had no fruit, no chocolate, and no eggs, and it didn't need any of them. The filling was cream, sugar, flour, butter, and nutmeg, poured raw into an unbaked shell and slid into the oven, where the heat transformed it into something dense and trembling at the center, the way only a barely set custard can. You knew it was done when the edges had puffed and the middle still held a slight wobble. Not liquid, not firm, that narrow zone every experienced baker recognized on sight. Indiana claimed it as its own, and the women who made it measured the cream by the color and weight of the pour rather than by any cup. A dust of freshly grated nutmeg went across the top before it went in. You didn't skip the nutmeg. She made it every Thanksgiving and Christmas, and sometimes for no reason. And when she stopped making it, nobody else picked it up. The recipe sits in the box now, ink faded, flour dusted at the edges, waiting for someone who won't come. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Canned milk fudge was the sweet reward that came from the barest of cupboards. When chocolate was either too expensive or completely missing from store shelves, families turned to what they could still find: evaporated milk and sugar. You would pour both into a pot and boil it slowly until it thickened into a soft, caramel-colored slab of fudge. No cocoa powder, no cream, and no fancy equipment. Just two humble ingredients and a lot of stirring. If you had butter or vanilla, you added a little, but most people just let it cook down until it felt right. Once it cooled, it firmed up into something sliceable and sweet, like candy for the end of a very long day. Kids looked forward to it like it was a birthday cake, and grown-ups swore it tasted better than store-bought chocolate ever did. You could wrap it in wax paper or stack it in tins and make it last a few days if you had the discipline. Most times, it was gone by nightfall. Canned milk fudge was not just dessert. It was proof that even in the leanest moments, a little sweetness could still be found if you were willing to wait for it. Oatmeal pie emerged as the poor family's answer to pecan pie, substituting humble oats for nuts that had become impossibly expensive. The filling combined oats with corn syrup or molasses, eggs, butter, and vanilla, creating texture and sweetness remarkably similar to pecan pies wealthier families enjoyed. Baked until the top turned golden and slightly crunchy while the interior stayed gooey, oatmeal pie delivered satisfaction exceeding its modest cost. The recipe spread through communities where pecan trees did not grow and store-bought nuts were beyond family budgets. Women shared it at church gatherings, proud of solving the problem of making fancy pie without fancy ingredients. Children receiving a slice at Christmas dinner experienced the same joy as those eating the original. Oatmeal pie represented both practical necessity and culinary creativity, proving that substitution could produce something genuinely delicious and teaching families that holiday traditions could be maintained regardless of economic circumstances. In Depression-era kitchens, leftovers were sacred, and day-old rice was far too precious to toss away. Resourceful cooks repurposed these humble grains into rice croquettes, crispy fried bites that cleverly combined thriftiness with satisfying flavor. Typically prepared by binding leftover cooked rice with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, or, in leaner times, a flour and water paste, these golden brown croquettes showcased genuine culinary creativity. If pantry stocks allowed, cooks might incorporate finely diced onions, garden herbs, or even bits of leftover ham or chicken to stretch the flavor further without spending extra. For added texture, stale bread crusts ground into crumbs often replaced costly store-bought breadcrumbs, an ingenious swap proving that empty pockets inspired surprisingly tasty innovations. Though croquettes originally hail from European cuisine, Depression-era American households enthusiastically embraced them, transforming simple leftovers into appetizers fancy enough for any potluck table. Interestingly, croquettes were practical as well as tasty. Frying provided a longer shelf life, essential in times when refrigeration wasn't guaranteed. Baking soda was really common to use as a deodorizer during the Depression. It's still something people more or less use, especially when they don't happen to have any better alternatives around. But back then, it was like the deodorizer, and nothing else would compare. It was multi-purpose and versatile. It was incredible at absorbing any kind of filthy odor and neutralizing them, and most others did a bad job because they would just mask these and wear off eventually. Baking soda, on the other hand, meant that you could actually eliminate the smells entirely and for a pretty low cost. Need to freshen the air? Sprinkle some of the stuff on your carpets, furniture, and anything else that doesn't smell quite the way God intended it to. Need to clean that fridge up? Open a can of baking soda on it and make sure your food smells just as good as the day you bought it. Those shoes violating your nose? Just a little bit of the stuff sprinkled inside will have your toes smelling like sunshine and rainbows. Don't believe me? You can try it out yourself. The stuff is innovative, and it's one of the best household hacks I've come across that really gets the job done too. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. 60 meals. 60 ways a generation kept their families fed when the banks closed and the work disappeared and the dust came in through the windows. Pick one this week. The hot water cornbread, the Hoover stew, the molasses biscuit your great-grandmother packed in a lunch pail. Cook it the way she did, with whatever was in the pantry, and tell us in the comments which one your family still remembers. Because these recipes were never about the food. They were about a woman at a stove deciding her children would not go hungry, no matter what the country had taken from her that morning.